TIFs, you ready? I'm going to start with just the Industrial Development Board TIF, since we've been talking about projects and how they work. I'm going to intersperse in here comparisons to Housing Act TIFs. But before I get into that, I want to just talk briefly about how we choose the entity to use. So you've got a company that comes to town, and they're a for-profit healthcare company. Typically, your hospital is one of your largest employers. Is that true here? I would bet it is. It's an economic engine. It has high-paying jobs. I did a project up in Northwest Indiana where there was going to be a replacement hospital for an old one, and a client of ours came in and bought the old hospital and was tearing it down and building a replacement hospital. And when they looked at it, to do what they were obligated to do was about I'm going to make up numbers here, say $100 million hospital. And the more they looked at it, they said, you know, this is a regional trade area, very much like Johnson City. And they said, if we were to put in a Da Vinci, that's the machine that is a robot surgery machine, they're what, $1.5 million? And if we were to expand this area and that area and spend another $50 million, we might be able to make this a regional healthcare hub. We'd be able to hire 25 more doctors, 150 more employees, you know, huge. And this was just in the teeth of the recession. And so I went up there with them to a little town in Indiana, and we had this conversation, and the community was thrilled. And so we did a pilot for the hospital. And up there, it's a much different law. The community actually does the pilot through the city. But in Tennessee, to do the same thing, which we were doing a replacement hospital in Shelbyville, you can't really fit that under the Industrial Development Board statute. So we ended up having to form a Health, Educational, and Housing Facilities Board in Bedford County in order to do the hospital deal. You have one, so you don't have that stuff, but early on in the process, lawyers have to stop and think, golly, it's not really a project. Does it fit over here? Another example, let's say we're going to do a mixed-use project. That's all the rage. In Nashville, we're getting some really beautiful ones if you've been to the Hill Center and Green Hills and some of those things. That's mixed office and retail. So can you do office and retail under an Industrial Development Board Act? Yes. They had originally wanted to do apartments on top instead of office and changed their mind to office. Can you do apartments for rent? Yes. I've got a client that called and wanted to go into another town in the area and put condos on top. Can you do condos? No. Boy, what a mess. So now how do you do a mixed-use facility? Well, you can't fit it under the project definition for an Industrial Development Board. So we're going to come back. One way you might be able to do it is under a TIF. And the other way you would do it is to have to condominiumize it, which you're probably going to do anyway because people are going to own those. And then you don't include the condos. So you sort through your act. If it's apartments and they're pure apartments, but they're for low to moderate income people, you're probably better off going through either the Housing Act or going through the Health and Ed and Housing Act, because the statute's a little more clear about what you can do for apartments. So part of all of our job is to, you know, always remember to stop and make sure it's a project and find a place where it fits. So when I say TIF is a project financing, again, under the Industrial Development Board, you have to have a project. Now, I get calls 2 or 3 times a day from people just with questions, and we, you know, if somebody's got a quick question, you know, we give a lot of these presentations. I'll just answer it, or I'll point them in the right direction. We don't charge until they get a project. But one of the questions I was getting all the time was, all right, we've got an interchange at the interstate that's green, and we'd really like to do a major retail development there, or we'd really like to have a hotel there, or can we go on and do a TIF now? And the answer under this statute is no, because you have to have a project. A project could be an industrial park, which doesn't have to then have anybody in it. It would have to be certified, a certificate of public purpose and necessity under the statute with the Department of Economic and Community Development. But other than that, it has to be a real project. So you got a chicken and egg problem. So you've got to get your first project in order to do your TIF under this act. Under the Housing Act, interestingly, the JCDA can do this, where you designate an area and you say, okay, this is my redevelopment area, and the incremental increase in property taxes in here as we put money into it through the increment, we're going to take X million dollars of that and use it to redevelop this area, and then you can allocate it as projects come. Very different concept. One big difference. You have to have blight. The whole area doesn't have to be blighted, but there has to be a blight study and some blight. Is an intersection that's just opened on the interstate that's got farmland on it blighted? No. So you can't use the Housing Act there. And you just have to wait till you can get your first project. Does this make sense? Just so you'll know, Memphis has its own statute. And as people like to say in Middle Tennessee, it's the largest city in Mississippi. But it has what's called a CRA. It doesn't have a housing agency. Very similar rules. And so if you hear people talking about the CRA or Memphis Steel, it could be slightly different. All right, so what we do here is we are going to identify a project. We're going to identify the increment. And then the concept is that the increment's new money you wouldn't have gotten otherwise without having induced this deal. So unlike a pilot, on a pilot you're taking property off the tax roll. Here you can't take the property off the tax roll. You're going to still get the amount of tax that you were getting on the property. That's called the base tax amount. You're only using the increase as the incentive. Make sense? Here's a quick example. It's really not one that you could get done unless the lender was the company, because there's no debt service reserve and no interest reserve and all that. But here, quick example. Let's say you've got $1 million on the tax roll, and after the project's done, it's $5 million. There's a $4 million increase. Your tax rate's $450 per 100, and that's city and county combined. That gives you $45,000 on the $1 million and 180,000. I'm sorry, the $5 million post assessment's $1 million value, and so you end up with a $180,000 increment. If you can track all that, I'm not going to get into it too detailed. Then you say, okay, let's do a 20-year pilot with $180,000. You put that in your calculator at 6%. That's combined principal and interest, and you can borrow $2,065,000. Okay, that's the amount that you could technically maximum, you know, at 6% get out of a project. We now have very complicated spreadsheets that we start with. We don't really want anybody to rely on a lawyer doing math, but it gives us an idea, and we're always happy to help you on those. So what you do is adopt an economic impact plan. And so I'm going to take a step back here and ignore my slides for a minute. And can you hear me if I, well, no, I know you've got this on the video. All right, let's do it this way. This desk is going to be a plant. Or let's say it's a huge retailer that's going to bring in $200 million a year in revenue, which is fantastic. And let's say the property tax on that alone will be significant. Let's assume it's $20 million. You could finance under a TIF with this. But it's anticipated that when this comes in, it's going to take the whole interchange, which is this pie from that wall to this wall. And that whole interchange, these two quadrants of the interchange are going to take off now because this is coming. It's been all over the papers in Memphis and Nashville. Let's call it IKEA. Okay? So IKEA is coming, and it's now going to make all of this land really valuable because everybody wants to be buying IKEA, and every millennial will no longer go anywhere else. My kids only go to IKEA. We don't even have one. So now you stop and say, wow, IKEA doesn't just want the 20 million because it's going to cost them, let's make up a number, 200 million to do their deal. And that's not enough. Other states are giving them, boatloads of money, and you're competing against the world with them. So what you say is, all right, gosh, if I give them a pilot, they get $20 million value off the tax roll over 20 years, net present value. That's basically what that calculation did. But if I can give them part of the increment for all of this, I can give them a lot more. And because I've got to bring in an interchange, I've got to bring in roads, water, sewer, gas, signage, all this public infrastructure, maybe a parking deck if we're going to do a hotel next to it. Hotels like to be next to this place. It's pretty amazing. So I say, okay, the Industrial Development Board names this entire room as the Economic Impact Plan area because you make a finding that this is what's going to be impacted. And now the community is going to get paid the same amount of tax it was getting paid on this. That's the base tax amount. But all of the increase in property tax over the next 20 years can be used as an incentive to get all of this ready, to help pay for all of this, and to bring IKEA. The first one done under the statute was the Nissan headquarters. It doesn't have to be a retail establishment, but it tends to work better for retail for a couple reasons. Let's assume we're doing a shopping center and not an IKEA, and there are 5 tenants. If you abate the property taxes, who gets the incentive? Who normally pays the taxes on a retail center? Tenants. Well, you're trying to get the money to the developer when you're trying to get the deal done up front. That doesn't work real well. But if you do a TIF, everybody pays the property tax just like the other ones would have paid. But the incremental increase can go then to the developer to help pay for the infrastructure cost, pay for the parking, to pay for the building, whatever you need done. So TIFs work particularly well for retail. Number 2, TIFs work particularly well when you've got something of such an impact, like IKEA, that it's going to transform an area. Unlike a manufacturing plant that, maybe it anchors an industrial park, but you see a lot of industrial parks with one building in them, right? They don't necessarily really kick it off like something like this would. And TIFs work particularly well when you've got a Japanese company and they want me to spend 3 days in New York talking to their bank, trying to explain to them why they're going to give them $100 million and lease it back. I wouldn't do that anymore. That was before they changed the statute to permit this. What I would do now with them, and I'm doing one for another foreign company right now, is do a TIF district that's just the size of this desk. Because then the company just pays the tax it otherwise would have paid, which is going to be very small because it's, the base tax would be very small because it was farmland. And we can give them the benefit of all the increment for up to 20 years. And it's more like a rebate than it is an abatement, but it works essentially the same way. So, next reason why this can be really helpful for you is during the downturn and right before, many major companies refinanced their debt. They started getting out of their debt covenants, and they'd have to go refinance their debt with their group of banks. And a lot of those very large credit facilities prohibited sale-leaseback transactions without bank approval. Well, what's a pilot? It's a sale-leaseback transaction. And so we would have to go get approval from the lending group to do a pilot, whereas on a TIF you don't. See the advantages? So we're seeing more and more use of TIFs, not just for retail, but sometimes for manufacturing facilities when you can fit it better and help the company get the deal done. Questions about that? Yes?
The downtown district in Johnson City is a TIF district, but I think it's under the housing.
It is, yes. Mm-hmm.
Can we still do a IDB TIF in a housing area TIF section?
Well, the answer is maybe. If you've allocated all of the increment already, then there isn't any increment left. And that would be a no. But I'll give you an example. I'm doing a project now in Franklin. Franklin has a TIF district at the new interchange where Nissan is. And it's relatively large. And it's a city TIF. The county didn't participate in it. So it's relatively small. Franklin has a very low tax rate. That's why it's a large area to get the money to them. And it's going to be paid back around 2018. I'm looking right now at doing another project in that district. And what we may do is layer it so that we do we'll probably do a pilot in there, but we'll abate the county taxes in it, and then we'll have the city's abatement kick in 2018 when that TIF district ends. In the meantime, we'll make a payment in lieu of tax equal to what the tax would have been to pay for the TIF that's already there. Complicated, but it works. We did the Jackson National Headquarters on that basis, and now we've got another one. Theoretically, you could do the same kind of thing in a TIF district where you said, okay, the current district is maybe abates 50% of the tax or 75% of the tax, and you could do another district for the other piece. Or if it's going to end, you could layer it so that it comes on at that time. Otherwise, you've used the increment.
The reason I ask is we're trying to figure out a way to market the fact that we have a TIF district. But if somebody, we're kind of restricted on the rules we can use as being a housing district.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody wanted to do a project downtown that was a retail project or something, or a commercial project, then it's hard. There's been a lot of unclearness on what we can do or what can be done. But if it's a new project, it could be a separate IDB TIF, even though it's in that district.
Yeah, the answer is that's going to be very fact specific, but it may be possible to do something. What's probably more likely is you see if you, always number one, let's see if you can fit it within the Housing Act. And if the Housing Act permits it, but your rules don't, then you change your rules. But you can use the increment under the Housing Act to do retail. You can use it to pay for public parking. You can use it for public infrastructure. You can use it for what's called land write-down. You can discount the land to them. So you can get the benefit to the company or the retailer by doing land write-down, for example. You won't be able to do it the same way you do an IDB, but let's be blunt, companies don't care what act you do it under. They just want the money. And if we can get them the money under that act through lowering their land cost, they're just as happy. So I will bet you for most of what you want to do, we can do it under the current structure. It may be that we have to change your rules, but as long as it's permitted under the statute, you can get there. We have done almost all of the downtown TIFs in the last 15 years in Nashville, our firm has. all of the TIFs in downtown Nashville are Housing Act TIFs. The IDB TIFs tend to be done where you don't have any blight. Now, I have to tell you a quick story just to give you an example of blight. I was hired by the Bredesen administration to help with the Dell deal, when Dell came to the Nashville airport. And we were struggling to figure out how to fit the incentive into some of the boxes like we're talking about now. And they wanted to go along the edge of the Nashville airport. It was right along the airport property. And the statute wasn't set up at that time to do some of what we're talking about now. And we started having a conversation. And Jim Murphy was city attorney, he's now my partner. And we were debating, and all of a sudden we said, well, gosh, there's a big water tower that had been knocked down laying next to the airport property, and an old abandoned building that had been like a mental health facility, as I recall. And then some shopping centers behind it that were closed up and boarded. If that's not blight, I don't know what is. And all the area doesn't have to be blighted. You just have to have blight in your TIF district. So we did a Housing Act TIF district that ran from Murfreesboro Road across the blighted property and then along the runway, and managed to get our airport construed as blighted. And it worked. So those are the kinds of things that we have to do under that act that you don't have to in the others, but as long as you've got some blight and you can justify it in a blight study, you can get there. And you've already done that because you already have it in place. Good question. We talked about this. You take the base property taxes, and now this is kind of interesting. They've changed the law again, and we now have what's called the Tax Uniformity Act, and it amends, you can't, lawyers in the room, you can't just look now at the Housing Act and at the CRA and the Industrial Development Board Act. There's another act that was passed, and it modifies all those acts, and it's in a different place, just to make life fun. And what it's done is it's now all of these have the same basic rules. They didn't used to. We used to be able to kind of shop some things. And I'll just go over this quickly, but it does apply to the JCDA because it says a housing agency is a housing agency organized under the statute or any public entity exercising the redevelopment powers of a housing agency. So you are that, okay? And your Industrial Development Board is also covered by this. So what it's done is it now says that you can go 20 years on a pilot. On a TIF, if Industrial Development Board, you can go 20 years. But you can extend the 20 years for the TIF under the Industrial Development Board Act with approval from the comptroller and the commissioner. It also limits what you can use the money for in a different way, and it changes the flow of funds a little bit from the community to the board or to the housing agency. Pretty simple stuff, but I always bring it with me because I always have to look at it carefully depending on the question, and it's relatively new. But now what it says is the base taxes are what the taxes were last year. So if you adopt the plan in 2015, the base tax is what the taxes were in 2014. Simple. That used to be what you did in Industrial Development Board TIFs, but it wasn't what you did in Housing Act TIFs. Now they're both the same. And then you can allocate the increment, the excess amount, to the incentive. You now, it used to be you could use the increment to, in essence, just rebate it to the company. You could collect it and then give a check back because it said it could be used for economic development purposes. They took that out and changed it to say it can be used for debt service on bonds issued to pay for costs. So now we always do a little bond in the deal for a TIF. And the board pledges the increment to secure that bond and to repay it. So the way I can explain this to a company is really quite simple. Somebody's got to go borrow the money to pay for the project. There's no project there, so there's no increment, correct? So somebody's gonna have to put some credit on it. Because no lender is gonna loan money to you, and then if you don't build it, they have no way of getting paid back. Right? So the company puts their credit on the bond. It could be the community. There are some ways we can structure that, but well, it's not gonna be a guarantee, let's put it that way. There are some other tricks that we've used, but bottom line is you put credit on the bond, and then you borrow the money, you use it to pay for the project, then the project gets assessed, the incremental increase gets paid just like it normally would, but it's rebated to the Industrial Development Board, who uses it to pay back the bond. And the only thing the board's obligated to do is to take that check and pay it on the bond. There's no liability as long as it does that, which it's got to do because the assessors and the tax trustee make sure. So the money flows to the lender. So from the company's standpoint, I can summarize it real simple. You're going to borrow the money and somebody else is going to pay it back for you. How about that deal? And they go, really? I go, yeah, that's the incentive. As long as you build it and it creates the increment, that's going to pay it back for you. Okay? So when you really cut through a TIF, it's just that simple. Somebody else, i.e. the community, is going to use their increment to repay some of the money you borrowed to do the deal. I had to actually write that down. It sounded pretty good. All right, we talked about it has to have a project or an industrial park. There's very specific requirements for the plan. You have to identify the boundary. Remember, wall to wall, to wall to wall. I always put in the map, tax, and parcel numbers to help the assessor. You have to identify the project, and then you have to get into the benefits of the project. So if it's retail, what are the benefits, folks? Throw them out. Sales tax. Can you do a sales tax TIF in this area? No, it's property tax TIF. Let's say that again, it's really important. You can't use the sales tax to pay back the bond. You keep it. So there's your really big incentive on a retail deal, okay? In other states, you can use the increment. And for a little while, they had a special statute that let Bristol and Kingsport fight over one, which you're well aware of, I'm sure. That's gone. But you simply take the increment and pay back the debt, and you set out the benefits in the plan, you set out the duration, and I always put in any requirements. So this is where it gets fun for me, because I do a lot of work with communities and I do a lot of work with developers and companies. And when I'm on the community side, don't tell the developers, I'll say, well, what requirements do you want of these guys? Let's talk about it before we talk to them. You want a median. You want a turn lane. You want a light with a turn signal. You want to upgrade to metal poles. You want acorn street lights. You want the detention pond to be under the parking lot. You know, these are all expensive things I'm throwing out. But you do your wish list and you negotiate with them, and they say, no. I want the cash to pay for my building. And then you work through it. And if you can use all of the increment to pay for public infrastructure, there's a huge advantage to both. Number one, it's something you wanted anyway, it's public infrastructure. And you're just paying it back with public money, tax money, paying back something that you're gonna own. From the company's standpoint, if it's going to public infrastructure that the community owns, the company doesn't have to pay any income tax on that. The money's not going to them. Make sense? If you use it to pay for the shopping center, they may end up having property tax. I'm sorry, income tax. So we have to, I always try to make sure they understand and get good tax analysis on that side, because the last thing you want to do is have them go broke because they ended up having to pay 39.5% income tax and they didn't budget it. And there's some ways they can trap that in the basis of the property, but then when they sell it, they'll have more capital gain tax. That would be better if they do that. If they're going to use it for something other than public infrastructure or public parking, you have to get approval from the comptroller and the commissioner. under our new statute. That didn't used to be true. So far, we've gotten approval on every one we've asked. But they typically are pretty important projects when you do that. Redevelopment of a mall, bringing in something that's going to have a lot of benefit. And that's part of why setting out the benefits is so important. You sell it to the community that way. You sell it to the commissioners that way, the comptroller that way, the media that way. And just frankly, to yourself. This is different. For an IDB TIF, the IDB has to prove it after 21 days notice in a public hearing. Then 2 weeks notice in a public hearing. Then each taxing agency that's going to contribute its increment has to prove it. Remember on a pilot, we said we're going to give the title to the Industrial Development Board and it comes off the tax roll and the city doesn't have any voice, kind of, whichever one didn't vote, it's just off the roll. Here, everybody that's going to give up their increment has to prove it. So if you're going to do it in Johnson City, for example, and it's in Washington County, it would be the Washington County Commission, the Industrial Development Board, and the city. If it's in Sullivan County, it'd be the Sullivan County Commission and the Industrial Development Board and the city. If they don't all approve it, you can't use their increment. Okay? Big difference.
If one approves it and the other doesn't, can you still get the?
You can still do it, but only with the increment that's been approved. Franklin's my example of that, where Franklin did the TIF and the county did not. We already talked about this. It's 20 years unless you get approval by the state. And interestingly, the best interest of the state definition for the approval from the comptroller and commissioner is they have to conclude for using the money for the private purposes that the deal couldn't have gone forward without the incentive. So you have to make the case that this incentive made the difference. That's typically easy to do because the numbers don't work without it. If you're going to go beyond 20 years, they have to make the decision that it needs to go longer in order to actually make the project work to pay the financing off in that time period. This is the real advantage of a TIF. Title stays in the company. Everybody just pays the tax they normally would. Pilot we've talked about. Property affected, for a pilot, it only covers my table. It's just the project. The TIF covers your plan area. And we talked about the approvals. You don't have a leasehold tax issue on a TIF because the title's in the company. So all that wild ride I was telling you about in the beginning goes away. And that's me. Okay. Everything I just said about the TIF for IDBs is now essentially the same as housing authority TIFs. You've got some that predate the statute, you don't have to comply with it. But new ones you do, you will need to. Health and ed boards, we talked about earlier. Health and ed boards can do pilots on projects under their statute, but they don't have authority to do TIFs. So if you want to do a TIF for a hospital, it would have to be in a blighted area and use a Housing Act redevelopment TIF. Interesting, isn't it? Hotels and motels. Let me just give you I can go on for an hour about this. I'll just give you the short answer. If you're in the center city area of a central business improvement district, then with certain approvals you can do a hotel or motel. It qualifies as a project. The statute though says that IDBs can't own hotels and motels unless they're part of a convention center or of a certain size. So just being conservative, I do hotels and motels through TIF because IDB doesn't own it. Make sense? You do have to have a finding that it's going in an area that is going to have substantial economic impact. So if you're going to put it someplace there's already 30 hotels and motels, that gets to be a little hard to make the finding. But so you're going to have a finding that it's an area of substantial economic impact to do it, even under the TIF statute. And we can go on. All right, so that was a lot. But we've got some time. Let's hit the hard questions, these, the fun things. I'm curious, let's start with just what is it you guys want to incentivize? I'll lead with jobs, right?
I have a question. Let's assume that the city or a county wanted to build an industrial park,
Mm-hmm.
and they use TIF money.
Mm-hmm.
They can buy the land with TIF money. They can build infrastructure with TIF money. But they're not gonna have any increase in taxes until they get something built in that industrial park.
Mm-hmm.
But they're gonna have bond payments to make in the meantime.
Right.
And the city and county is about to pay that debt out of their general tax funds. Can they pay themselves back out of the tax increment later?
Yes. It gets to be several steps in there, but the ultimate question is there's a way to structure that. You raise a really good point. That I think is worth pointing out the subtlety in that. I said there's two things you can do under the Industrial Development Board TIFs. One is projects and one is industrial parks. And that somebody has to put their credit on it if it's a project because there's no increment yet, right? Industrial park, there is no project yet necessarily. And this is almost mind-boggling, but to get a certificate of public purpose and necessity to do an industrial park, if you already have a company identified that's going to be the anchor for the park, you can't put the credit of the city and county on the bond to pay for the park because you've identified the company, and that's lending the credit of the community for on behalf of a private company, which is unconstitutional. So if you're going to do the park, you want to do it before you've landed the company. And because that statute under the Industrial Park Act lets the community, if they haven't identified the company, guarantee the bonds, you can do what you described. But we're under now 3 different statutes and layering them, but it is doable. Okay? Yes?
I don't want to be selfish here, really put you on the spot, since we have a lot of our county commissioners who
Okay.
have been extremely helpful in working through a project right now, as we're referring to as Project X. We've been on several phone calls with a variety of people,
Mm-hmm.
county mayors. Can you kind of explain an example, similar to Project X, where the community comes in, purchases a building, and leases that back to a company over a period of time, and how that works through an incentive?
Okay, well, there's several different questions in there. I mentioned early on that there's some issues with what cities and counties can do versus industrial development boards. I'm going to give you some examples. Years ago, I got called because Oric had done their project over in Cookeville as a pilot, and they had opened a headquarters in Nashville, and they're supposed to get a grant from the state to help pay for the headquarters. The problem was that the state can't give a grant to Oric. In Tennessee and most states east of the Rockies, the law is that there has to be a law that permits you to do what the government wants to do it. West of the Rockies, it tends to say, as long as it's not prohibited, they can do it. Interesting. That's why in California and Arizona and these places, there are referenda all the time, because they're limiting what the state can do. I don't know if you saw in the news, but California had banned by referendum the sale of foie gras because they didn't like the way the goose was treated. Seriously. And the federal court struck that down as unconstitutional because it was interstate commerce. But that's how far it goes in California. They're having on their ballot, we're going to prohibit foie gras, because otherwise the state could permit you to have foie gras. Here we're the opposite. We have to, as lawyers, find where the state can do it, the city can do it, the county can do it, the IDB can do it. And the state can't make a grant directly to the company. So the state makes a grant to the city, the county, or the Industrial Development Board. It can make those grants. Next step down, cities and counties can't make grants directly to companies. Same reason, there's no statute that says that. They can make grants to industrial development boards. So the way this would work is the city and county, or county, will take funds and can grant it to an industrial development board, and the industrial development board can then take that money, and it has the power, as you saw, to buy buildings and lease them. That's how that can be done. The city and county have to be careful, because if they go borrow the funds and put the credit on it, and the company's identified, now they're doing it on behalf of a private company. So we have to be careful how those funds flow and what the money's going to be used for, where it originates. It can be paid back from an increment, it can be paid back from rent, but we may need to look at where the funds come from. And so as we get into a project like that, we've got to identify where the money's going to be. Okay? Non-tax revenues work for anything. When we did the Titans deal, I mentioned that earlier, here's an example of how this has to play out sometimes. That's a $228 million deal at the time. Probably double that today. We're having trouble finding the money to pay for the city's portion. And when we looked at it, the state was making a grant to the city to pay for the Gateway Arch. That bridge that goes across Korean Parkway, that big bridge. The city can borrow money to build a bridge. The city couldn't borrow money to give it to the Titans. So the state agreed to let the city take that money and borrow the money for the bridge, and the state gave the money to the IDB, or well, Sports Authority, to help pay for the Titan Stadium. We just moved it around. So we may have to have those conversations next to see where we can move the money around. But we've got to get the flow of funds in the right way so that we don't have money borrowed for on behalf of a private company by a government. IDBs can borrow the money and use the increment to pay it. You can use increment from a larger area. Housing authorities can use the increment that's already on the books. That's fine. So there's a whole series of questions in that. But yes, it's very doable. And then you can do the incentive package on top of that. Apartments, I want to mention, we talked about condos. In a TIF, let's assume we've got our TIF district, and we put in the 8 major retailer, and you're getting your sales tax and everything's humming. And when an apartment complex comes in and it converts to condos or single family residences over here, that's not the project, is it? The project's this. The increment from that can still go to this. The increment from that can still pay for the public infrastructure. So that's another real advantage of a TIF district, is that if that's a benefited area, the reason people are moving there is because they can walk over and get Swedish meatballs at lunch. That increment can go towards the project, but it's not the project. And so that's another way we can look at some of these things. Make sense? Yeah.
On the side of the project, Tom, what are the restrictions on how big it can be, or is it? I mean, can you make your TIF district, as large as the county, or?
No. The statute says you have to identify the area benefited by the project. And that's a governmental decision. The IDB, the city, the county, the people contributing their increment all have to agree. This is the benefited area. It's typically pretty obvious. We're doing the Oak Ridge Mall redevelopment. That TIF district is the mall, plus the land around the mall that is likely to be redeveloped. It's underutilized. So you can see that. You wouldn't go 6 blocks, but you might go a block or a half a block and feel quite comfortable. So that TIF district is larger than the mall, because it's likely that when that mall's redeveloped, you're going to have retail and restaurants come that aren't there now. Make sense?
Yeah, but could you make the argument that if you go down Emory, Emory Valley Road, going towards the lake, that it's going to increase those areas as well if there's some, vacant property out there?
Yeah,
that's
we,
gonna include that?
potentially. I mean, that's where the judgment call comes in. Personally, I think it needs to be contiguous.
Okay.
I would have a hard, it could be across the street, but I would think it has to be contiguous or else you really look like you're stretching. I mean, theoretically, if you put this big development here, the next interchange is probably going to develop sooner, right? But I wouldn't feel terribly comfortable about that. But those are judgment calls. The statute just says you have to have a finding that it's the benefited area. Yes? Hi.
When you update to the public chapter 605, it indicates that you can use 5% of the incremental revenue.
For administrative
for
fees.
administrative fees.
Yep.
In the situations we talked about, could that 5% be used for any IDB cost or any JCPA cost, or does it have to be specifically identifiable to that one TIF project? I mean, obviously, the IDB or the JCPA would be administering these TIF programs, but how lenient is that 5% usage?
This is why I always keep it with me. What it says is any plan may provide that a total of up to 5% of incremental tax revenues may be set aside for administrative purposes, including expenses incurred by the tax increment agency and tax agency administrative offices, assessor, property and/or trustee or other tax collecting official in administering the plan and including a reasonable allocation of overhead expenses. When I got to the first part, I would have said, that's really broad. But then when it says, and including a reasonable allocation of overhead expenses, that says to me they're intending that it be allocated. And so you're really trying to capture the expense of the board and the offices and the tax collecting agencies for having to deal with this. Subject to argument. If you really think that you'd like to go beyond that, frankly, I'd probably go talk to the comptroller's office who we worked with. There were 3 law firms and the comptroller worked on this, we were one of them, and see what they were thinking to get the legislative history. But I read it to mean it really ought to tie to this plan district.
Can I ask one other question?
Sure, absolutely. That's why I'm here.
There's also a reversion of your unused
Right.
increments. So. if
That's new, yeah.
you've got that set up and that area would have generated the incremental tax and you paid it into the JCBA or the IDB or whatever, and there isn't really a project for that,
Mm-hmm.
then I read this that money goes back to the cities and counties, is that correct?
Correct. The question is when. It's not
Well,
clear.
It isn't clear, it doesn't say.
It doesn't
within
say.
A year or 5 years.
Right.
Or what.
So I do think, reasonable time, but
Okay. Not been any.
there's nothing yet. And that's another one where if we really have a lot of that accumulating, I'd probably go sit down with the comptroller again and ask, well, how do we want to play this out so that everybody's on the same page? The reason I mentioned the comptroller, they led this effort to amend the statute and make it uniform, and also they added that really towards the end of the conversation. There's some drafting issues where you go, well, how does that work? And I've not had one yet where there was money left over. It's funny how you can find places to spend it. And so, as a practical matter, and this is only going to be applicable for new ones. So your existing plans, this doesn't apply to. They're grandfathered. So I don't believe you've got one yet that was done after the adoption of this, and so as of today, I don't think your plans are governed by this, either the 5% or the reverter, and so you can still do what you used to do. Going forward, we'll have to keep an eye on that. Great question. The other one that no one really has a good handle on is how this city-county debt service issue works. Does it get certified every year? Does it get certified up front and go to sleep? If it can change all the time. See, the increment is the incremental property tax increase over the base tax amount. Then they added, but you can only use for the incentive the portion of that over the amount that's dedicated taxes for financings. Well, it doesn't say on the books as of the day of the TIF. Most people read it that way, but it'd be almost impossible to finance something if the lender's planning on using the increment to pay back their loan, and then the community goes and builds 35 schools at one time and says, okay, now we're going to use half that increment. You go, well, now, how's the lender get paid back? And so that issue is still rather vague out there. I think most people interpret it to mean the dedicated taxes at the time you close the TIF, but you can read it otherwise. So there's 3 or 4 things in here that are going to have to get sorted out. That's one of them. It's not unusual for a new statute. Other questions?
I've got one more.
Sure.
Central business improvement districts. Can you talk about how those are set up and hopefully how the money is governed?
And how they're used. Okay, central business improvement districts. Let me just also make another global point for those of you who don't read the statutes every day. There are probably 15 statutes that have incentives in them. We don't use most of them. There's a Public Building Authority Act, there's railroad incentives. There are all kinds of interesting things out there, but often they're just really hard to use. If you have a mega site, you can set up a mega site authority if it's going to be across counties, or if you want multiple counties to contribute to it. I helped write that statute. It was for Haywood County. It could be used anywhere. And it has all the powers of an industrial development board. So it's very similar to an IDB, except rather than being a joint board, it lets you use revenues from several counties to help pay for a mega site incentive. I don't know if you're working on any mega sites, but the state's about out of them, so that's another project worthy of consideration. To your question, I call them CBIDs. It's, how many of you have ever read the Housing Act? Now, all of you on the board, housing, the JCDA, raise your hand. We won't, it's odd. It actually is, when you read it, you're reading along and it's basically urban redevelopment. And it's got some of the TIF stuff in there. And then it's like, wow, it's like a whole nother statute added at the end of it, and you're kind of starting over. And it is. It was just a complete rewrite, but they left the old one and added the new one. They've done the same thing in the CBID statute. You can read the statute, you go, okay, I got this, and then you turn the page, you go, it's like a new statute. And it is. They just added another one on. And what that does is, means that you can do it 2 ways. You can form a central business improvement district, and this is important, you can have more than one. It's not just for downtown. Nashville has 3. The Gulch, if you've seen that, that is a CBID also. What it means is that you're identifying an area that is connected in the way that people do business in it. Our 12th South Corridor in Nashville, which is just taken off. Property values have tripled in 5 years. Crazy. There's another one. And what you do there is you say, okay, we'd like to, under the First Act, we'd really like to have a common sense of who we are. We're going to be called the district. We're going to be called 12th South. We're going to be the Gulch. We're going to be downtown. Originally, when Nashville did it, the businesses there pay an extra special assessment, and it's used to pay for the dolly trolley, those trolleys that run around, things like that, and for more trash pickup. Because Nashville doesn't have enough alleys to get garbage trucks down there. If you go down there about 6:30 or 7 at night, you go, wow, there's trash sitting on the sidewalks. But people have to, in some of these little shops, they have no other way to do it, to take it out. And so the trucks come around and pick it up. That's paid for extra from the special assessments. So you can use special assessments in the area to do special things. And you don't have to have a special assessment, though. I've done one in a community where the sole purpose of doing it was to have some uniformity, where everybody has park benches, certain distance. They have similar awnings on their buildings. They've got upgraded street lights, those antique-y looking acorn lights. And they put, I think it's Muzak in the light poles, so that when you're strolling around, everybody's got Christmas music or whatever certain times of year. There's no assessment in that district. You don't have to have an assessment, but everybody has to comply with those rules. So it's a way of layering, almost like zoning, but it's more of a district-wide community decides how to do it. That can be done through a board of managers, or it can be imposed by the city or county that's adopting the CBID. So that's the two different statutes, is who imposes the rules. Most of the ones I've done are small, and they've been done by the city, just saying this is what we want. And they were done for purposes of being able to do a hotel. But you can also do it with a board elected by the people who own property in the district, and they can assess themselves. And it's very much like a homeowners association, and used to upgrade the area and create an identity. If I'm doing a TIF that's going to be challenging, you can layer the special assessment in there to help pay back the TIF. One of the problems with TIFs is that if the property taxes go down, you can't pay back the bond. And so some lenders have asked, can you put a CBID in place and put a floor on the amount of money, so that if the tax rate goes below the amount necessary to service the bonds, the special assessment will kick in and pay for it, because we're using this money to upgrade their district. That is technically doable. I'm not sure it's been done yet. We've looked at it twice, and then the economy sank and the deals didn't go forward. But the bottom line is CBIDs are a very good tool for creating an identity in an area, bringing the property owners together to have a shared vision, to get special assessments that they pay to enhance the area, or not, you don't have to, and to basically upgrade that district. And it's for business purposes. It needs to be for business. You can use the money for all kinds of things. You can use it for parks, you can use it for sidewalks, for street improvements, for lighting, for parking, for awnings, park benches, all kinds of stuff. Several of the little pocket parks in downtown Nashville were financed with that. To answer your question? Anything else? This is always fun. I am curious, just quickly, what do you want to incentivize? Manufacturing typically has jobs that pay more than your median wage, and so people tend to go after that. Headquarters, obvious. Retail? What kind of retail?
New.
New
Not in the
retail.
market.
New.
Pardon me?
Not in the market retail.
Okay, so new retailers to the market. Some communities, and I'm always reminded of this when I get out in some of the smaller towns. I mean, you're blessed. You've got interstates all over the place, and you've got great retail in certain areas. When you get into some of these small towns that are an hour off the interstate, they would kill for McDonald's. You know, those that have McDonald's would kill for a fast casual restaurant where they could, you know, actually sit down and have dinner. So it depends widely. But new retailers, like, you know, I did a project in Clarksville which helped get Publix. Because, you know, they basically had one grocery chain that was, you know, fine, but they wanted the choice. There have been several deals done with Publix. Target has come to some communities with TIFs that they might not have otherwise come to. People do them for great big, you know, retailers like we're talking about, but those are unusual. Most of the deals are done for very targeted things like we're discussing now. We'd really like to have these kind of retailers we don't have. And so I do encourage you to have that conversation so that you can, you know, is it fast casual? Is it, you know, more of a Walmart? Is it hospitals? Is it upgrading your hospital? Is it new medical office buildings? I've done some to get a new MOB. Counties that have an old county hospital that they can't really afford to upgrade, but they don't really have good doctor's offices or surgery centers, you could do incentivize a new building and people can go have their outpatient surgery there, and it's a much nicer experience than having to go into the old hospital. So those are the kinds of things, but I do think that conversation among a group like this is really healthy because everybody's swimming together. When the company comes, you don't have to be selling in front of the company, which is always a bad thing, because then there are people arguing about whether they really want you. And once the company's there, everybody needs to want them. Make sense? Anything else? All right.
Appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.